Okay, good afternoon, everyone. That's today is what day is today? October 15th, 2022, and we are going to talk about the Asian philosophy, and then today's subject is about the Confucianism in Tang Dynasty, which I will focus around the middle of the 8th century, between 750 to 850, during this 100 years. I think that's the key development in the Confucianism. If you have been, let me go through our schedule. Okay, so I've been skipped a few weeks because October is quite busy week. A busy month, so okay, so I should go back to my weekly meetup. So today we will go. If you were here before, and you probably know, we haven't talked about Confucianism for a long time, and then not because I don't want to talk about this. The reason is the history between the 3rd century up to now. Confucianism has been practiced but not been a focus in China. So right now, today we were going back to Confucianism. Okay, so that's in the let's fix the time on the 750 CE. Okay, so that's this week. And if you read the book, the assignment reading, you will find out the next week. The chapter is talking about the cosmologist, and the most cosmologists are in Song Dynasty, which is 300 years later. And the author, Feng Youlan, only put about 3-4 pages into Tang Dynasty. So I don't see that's a good treatment. So I want to make this week as a special section, give more information about the Tang Dynasty. So if you go through the schedule, if I follow the schedule, next week we will talk about the Song Dynasty. The important the Song Dynasty, talk about cosmologist. And then when we call cosmologist, basics in another sense is metaphysician. Okay, so but Chinese metaphysics is different than Western sense of metaphysician. Okay, because the Chinese talk about the existence of God, the immortality of soul, or the human, the free mind, freedom, okay, free will. But that's called cosmology. And later on, you will see so-called the two school and the principal school and the mind-heart school. That will be kind of similar to in European philosophy. We talk about continental, Kantian, and Humean, this kind of separate. Then we go all the way around. So about 300 years down the road, Zhu Xi will have the Neo-Confucianism, which is important. So the development of the Neo-Confucianism is a long route, take about like 300-400 years to get mature. So that's the case we are going to do. So let me move on. So let's go through the history. Okay, so if you look at the history, I have showed this chart for many times, and then just 1 minute. Okay, so in this one, we spend time on the so-called the 6 famous schools: legalism, Taoism, Confucianism, the school of names, all this one in the early time. And then we go through the history, right? So during the Han Dynasty, we talk about Confucianism. That's important, the Dong Zhong Shu. Okay, if you remember, Dong Zhong Shu, that's the Confucianism, but the Confucianism is different than the Confucianism Confucius taught. It put a lot of effort on the heaven and the human interaction. And during the 1st century, during this about the 1st century or 0th century, the beginning of century, they have the Confucianism revolution, but it only take about 14 years and it failed. Then after that, the development is more on the religious side. So the heaven part has gone into the Taoism, so become the Neo-Taoism. And in the Jin dynasty, they have the China split to south and the north. In the southern part is more on the Neo-Taoism, and the northern part will focus because during that time, the Buddhism start to transfer to China. So they become heavy Buddhism thinking. So we have been spent a few weeks talk about Buddhism, about the Xuanzang, about the Kumarajima. Okay, so this famous Buddhism, they translate the Buddhism religion to China. And during this period of time, if you look at the Chinese development, basics, the government is still, we can call it the Confucian government. But in the literature, philosophy, most people, they are in the thinking of Taoist religion and also in the Buddhism religion. So during that time, it's a more religious feeling, okay, during the time. So today, we are going to talk about the 4 subjects. We are going to talk about this. Basics, right now, if you set your time frame, we are in the Tang Dynasty, which is around 600 to 900 during this time. And then there's 4 subjects I would like to cover today. So first one, I will spend, each one I plan to spend about half hour to cover. So the first part would be the history of the Tang Dynasty. Okay, and then we talk about a person. His name is Han Yu. I would like focus more on this person. He's very important in Chinese philosophy, literature, history, political, and that I think people have a different opinion. Some people will like him, some people don't think he did good, but I try to my best to introduce what's his work. And then the third part, I will focus on basics. That's the reading for today. We talk about the Neo-Confucianism. Okay. Then I will bring up the actual people, Liao. Liao is a person also introduced by the author, Feng Youlan, but he kind of ignored another important person. His name is Liu Zhongyuan. Okay. He is, in my opinion, he probably more important, well, I should not say more important, but Liu Zhongyuan, personally, I like his writing, his philosophy, so I would like to bring this one to kind of like counter what Han Yu is talking about. So before I started for first part, we will talk about the history of Tang Dynasty. Is any question, comment, or any thing you want to talk about, or any question before I start? You can raise your hand. Or... Everything fine? Okay. So let's move on the first part of the history of the Tang Dynasty. So I should not assume everybody familiar with Chinese history, but and then Tang Dynasty is very rich. There's a lot of things we can talk about. So I just have to pick up things I think is important. I cannot cover everything, but let's try and give some background about the Tang Dynasty. So Tang Dynasty, before Tang Dynasty, okay, Chinese has about I would say about 300 years disunion. Okay, basically look at this map. Okay, this map put it on 376 CE. Basically, China is not one China. Technically, it's 2 parts, in the southern part and the northern part. And then we don't have to go to the detail, but you can see on the south part, they go through the eastern Jin and then go to the Song, Qi, Liang, Chen. So they kind of 5 dynasty, one after the other, and then each one only take about 50 years. So if you can imagine, if you live in the southern part of China during that time, you probably face every 50 years. So your lifetime probably have 2 dynasties. Okay, always have some coup or some revolution happen. Okay, that's the south part. And the northern part face a different situation because they have 5 tribes. When we say tribe, Chinese call barbarian, just like a Greek like to call non-Greek barbarian. 5 nomadic tribes, okay, set up different kingdom during that time. So north and the south are a little bit different. And we introduced during this time in the southern part, the Chinese developed the so-called Neo-Taoism, and gradually also have the religion, the Taoism religion start to develop during this time. So after that, we will start to have the unification of China. So after 300, 400 years, then they have the Sui and the Tang dynasty. So they start to unite the China. So Sui dynasty is very short-living dynasty, only lasts for, I think, 39 years, and then come with the Tang dynasty. And the Sui and the Tang dynasty are a little bit different because they are not so-called the pure Chinese race, basically, since they are in the north. So they carry the Chinese last name, but they all intermarried with family of the nomadic tribe and the Turk origin. So they are not culturally, blood-wise, are not pure Chinese in this sense. And then, but their development, Chinese usually will refer this period, Tang Dynasty and the Song Dynasty, as the Golden Age, because culturally it's very well developed. And the more important is, if you look at the China, from the East, the Chinese culture, okay, I say culture, not only including writing, technology, medicine, food, okay, architecture, painting, calligraphy, anything start to export, start to influence from to the East side, which is Korea and Japan. And the Silk Road connect to the West side, to Indian, to Roman, to the Europe, start to connect it for the trade. So during that time, there's a lot of development. So all the Chinese or people in the Chinese culture like to talk about this period of time. And then it's very difficult for me to introduce the culture in the Tang Dynasty. I just have this all the world: poetry, calligraphy, landscape painting, philosophy, political thought, historical writing, scientific advancement, astrology, chemistry, medicine, and production of fine silk, porcelain, tea, and blah, 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 everything, during this period of time. Important concept I like to make here is so-called Han Dynasty and the Tang Dynasty. Okay, so Han Dynasty, so people in China or not in Asia, people like to call this Han as a race. Okay, so Han more represent the race of Chinese or the nationalism of Chinese, and the Tang is more represent the cultural Chinese. So in most of the major city, major country, you all find the Chinatown, okay? But in Chinese, people don't call it the Chinatown. People call it the Tang People's Street, okay? So technically, Tang represents the culture, the food, the living style, okay? And Han more represent your race and the nationality. So that's, I have to say about the unification of China after 300-400 years of this union. Okay. So if you look at this world, okay, during this time, if you take the global look, the bird's eye view of this world, you will see in this world, actually, Europe is really not that important. Okay, so basics, it's Roman Empire. And you look at this one. And then the major player in this world, you will see the Tang Empire here. And then they have the Tibetan Empire, which is established almost the same time as the Tang Empire. And the Wei Empire, okay, on the north. So on the Asia, that's this one. And then Umayyad, okay, after, I think if we take 750, it's Umayyad Caliphate. If 751, that becomes the Abbasid, okay, Caliphate. But anyway, basically, this world is dominated by Tang, Umayyad, Tibet, and Wei. Okay, so that's the land during this period of time. And I always like to think about this question when we talk about between 600 and 800, and 600 in Europe is the Gregory the Great. After that, and 800 years, that's the Charlemagne, right? And that's the starting of the so-called Carolingian Renaissance. Okay, so I think very hard, between these two persons from 600 to 800, I cannot think about any Western philosopher, during this period of time. Okay. So, I don't know, probably I don't read enough. And if somebody know, please let me know. I don't know, anybody know any famous people between 600 and 800? But on the other hand, okay, in Chinese, okay, during this period of time, it's a ton of people. Today, I only can introduce 3 philosophers. But if you want to go more, they have a lot of poets, they have a lot of painter, calligrapher, and many things happen during this period of time. But unfortunately, in Europe, probably we cannot find many people, many famous advancements during this period of time. So that's the part very interesting to me. So let me move on. Okay, since I cannot have everything together, I just made this the major event between 600 to 900. So we can roughly put this way, from 618 all the way to here. Okay, this one is about 100 years. Here's about 100 years. This one we will call it the golden age, okay, of Tang. So the country, the empire is growing. So you will see a few great empire, for example, Taizong of Tang, and we introduced about Taizong. Okay, it's during the Xuanzang, okay, the Buddhist monk, right? And another famous Empress Wu, that's the Chinese only female empress, okay, female leader. Okay, so that's all the golden time. And after that, they have Xuanzong, okay, Tang Xuanzong and his famous lover, Yang Guifei. So during these 100 years, I think it's about 100 years, that's really a highly developed country, and the nation is expanding. But at the 751, okay, Chinese or Tang Empire start to face some defeat. So first defeat is the new empire, Abbasid Caliphate. They alliance with the Tibetan Empire, fight against the Chinese Tang Dynasty. And the general is Gao Xianzhi, and he lost, okay, the war. And because of this situation, according to legend, the history, the Chinese technology, especially paper making, printing, campus, and gunpowder, start to transfer to West. And that's what Francis Bacon, I think Francis Bacon calls the great invention. Okay, this one. So at the 755, there's another rebellion happened, so-called the Anlushan Rebellion. So basics make the great shake the entire empire. Okay, So the country becomes so-called the warlord, okay, because you know, after a lot of civil war and you have to specialize, you have to give the general super power. So the general become, set up their own little kingdom. So we call it the warlord, but the situation stabilized the Tang Empire. So during this period of time, okay, that's the philosopher we are going to introduce for today. It's Han Yu, Liao Zhongyong, and Liu Yuxi. I decided to skip this person because I probably don't have the time. And then follow on that is the persecution of Buddhism. I'll briefly introduce this one. And then, so probably China will enjoy about, let's put this way, from this year after 50 years to this year, that's about 50 years of disturbance, okay, a lot of war. But after there, they have China start to enjoy another 150 years, about 100 to 150 years, stable, but not that strong country. But during this period of time, a lot of philosopher, cultural movement started to develop. That's what I would like to introduce. So the history move further. There will be the end of Tang Dynasty, so-called the Huang Cao, okay, Huang Cao rebellion, and then they put the Tang Dynasty to the end. But after that, they have about 100 years disunion. So I call it, usually historians call it 5 dynasty and the 10 kingdoms period. Okay, so we don't have to go detailed introduction, only hear this name, you know, in this land, they have the 5 dynasty and the 10 kingdoms. And when historians call 5 and the 10, it means much more than that. They have a lot of warlord. So after 100 years, then China get stabilized again. That's so-called the Northern Song Dynasty. This one, the Northern Song Dynasty and the Southern Song Dynasty. So this one is another period of time. It's interesting, and I will spend time next week. We will talk about in the Northern Song Dynasty. During this time, a lot of the culture is highly developed, but the power of the state is got weakened because you start to deal with the foreign from the north and from the east. So that's the major event on that. So something we need to a little bit introduce is about the Andusan rebellion. Okay, Andusan rebellion happened in 740 CE, and this one is a famous. Well, I should not say famous. I think this one pretty much represents the situation of Andusan. According to historical account, okay, first Andusan is not Chinese. He is. I don't know what's his race, but basically, because the Tang Dynasty, the royal family is not pure Chinese already, and they have a habit to hire the foreigner as a general. Okay, and you can imagine now people from the north, from the west, are more powerful and more on the military side. So they have the tendency to hire. To use this kind of general. For example, the person who lost the war to the Abbasid Caliphate is Gao Xianzhi, and he is Korean. He's from Korea. And Andusan, I think he is Turk. Okay, so according to historical account, he is a great general. And during the time is the Xuanzong, the emperor is Xuanzong, and with his famous wife Yang Guifei. Okay, one of the 4 great beauty in Chinese history. So the famous scene is Andusan, not only a general, and he also, he's very fat. Okay, and you can see the side, he's very fat. And I read the historical account, his belly, when he stand up, his belly can reach his knee. So this kind of person, but he's a good dancer. Okay, so it's hard to imagine people in this kind of figure can dance. So this figure, and he kind of the emperor is quite pleased with him because he can please the emperor very well. So he got a lot of power, and 755, he started to lead the rebellion, and he wanted to himself become the empire. So the rebellion got pacified in 2 years, but his adept son, Shi Shimin, okay, continued rebel. So basically take about almost 10 years, or 8 years. So basically, according to historical account, probably the 1/3 of Chinese population lost during this period of time. So you can imagine the terrible situation during the time. So after the situation got stabilized, the China will be different. It's no more central government, centralized government. It become the so-called warlordism. Okay, so basically you have to give the general enough power, not only the military power, also have the financial power to tax the people. So they become semi-independent. So we are going to talk about the cultural background during this time is this situation. So far, any question, comment? Anybody want to talk about? I hope it's clear, and because there's a lot of things we need to talk about. So, and I hope it's not I still make it clear.
Hey, Jason, did you already cover Wu Zetian in the last lecture?
No, I didn't. And there's another meetup talk about Wu Zetian. Okay.
No, only on her influence was the current topic was Neo-Confucianism and Confucianism, because she made a distinctive break, right, with Confucianism, and she endorsed Buddhism because it was better for her power. And
that's true. I didn't cover this one. I'm glad that you mentioned this one. Okay. I think that kind of my who is speaking? Chris, right? Okay. So Javier, you are next. Okay, I didn't ignore you. I just put your hand down. Okay. So yeah, Empress Wu. Okay, it's an interesting subject. I was thinking about talking about this, but I'm not sure I have enough philosophy to cover. Okay, if you are interested, I probably can bring back. I will talk about this just in a minute, okay? Because one thing I like to talk about her is she is a powerful woman, and just like Chris talked about, she will promote Buddhism, but I don't think she single-hand can promote Buddhism, because Buddhism during that time is already in the so-called major culture during that time. And she probably can take advantage of Buddhism, right? For example, a Chinese emperor usually call themselves the son of the heaven, but she's a female, and if you call her daughter of heaven, it's sons, because they already have a daughter of heaven, because daughter of heaven is kind of a servant, okay, not so powerful. So we consider herself of incarnation of what's the Buddha's name? Maya Treaty. Okay, so he considered herself of incarnation of one Bodhisattva. Okay, so that's one thing happened. Javier, you have seen anything you want to talk about?
No, I wanted to ask a question that I'm a little bit curious.
Okay.
All these people that you mentioned, they were rulers, but they were not from China. How they came to power? Through force? They invaded?
Okay, so put it right. Okay, I should make it clear on that. So I talk about the people. They are, I said they have Chinese last name, but they intermarriage with the foreign tribe. Okay, so if you think about it, your father married a foreigner, your grandfather also married a foreigner, and your great-grandfather also a foreigner. So in this case, you are not pure blood in this way.
Yes,
Okay.
Jason.
Hold on. Javier, you want to say something or something? You are muted. I think you have. It's Quen. Quen, you are speaking.
Yes,
I am very
to...
sorry.
Okay, hold on. Who is speaking? Javier. Okay, let's go, Javier. Let me answer Javier's question first. Okay, so they are foreigner, but they come to the power because they were the general. Okay, guarded the border. So so they have a coup. Okay, to overthrow the emperor. So they set up the Tang Dynasty. If I have to make it clear, make it simple, that's the way it happened. So they are Chinese, okay, from the father side, but their culture is a lot of Turkish culture. Okay. When I say Turkish, is this Turk? It's not today's Turkish. It's more on the Asian side. This kind of culture. Quen?
Yes, I just want to add a piece of historical precision. During the 3 centuries of collapse of empire between the fall of the Jing dynasty in 317 in the north and the reunification in 589 by the Sui dynasty, there was a group of called the Guanlong aristocracy. Yeah. Okay, it's written
Guanlong aristocracy. Yeah.
Yes, it's written Guanlong, and the G is pronounced like a K in the pinyin system. So Guanlong aristocracy, and that Guanlong aristocracy was in the northwest, and they, as Jason said very clearly, the father side was Chinese, and the mother side, most of the time, were Turkish people from Central Asia. Okay, and Central Asia correspond to what is called nowadays Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, etc. And that group of Guanlong aristocracy combined the traditional Chinese culture, the writing, the governmental structure, the ideal of empire, with the military power of the Turkish cavalry. So that group called the Guanlong aristocracy would be of utmost importance under the Sui and the Tang dynasty. And they kind of developed themselves during almost 2 centuries. And their triumph was precisely the creation of the Sui dynasty and the Tang dynasty. So those 2 dynasties were very cosmopolitan in the sense that there is a Chinese root, but there is also an opening to Central Asia.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for making it clear on that. So, okay, so right now, let's back to what we were more focused on. Just keep in mind, at that time, Chinese culture are more open. Okay, basics, many reasons. Okay, so Chang'an, a capital, is a metropolitan city, just like today's New York. Okay, because there are a lot of foreigners go to there. So, but right now we are talking about after the Anlushan rebellion. Okay, Chinese have become a little bit different because after 50 years war, okay, and a lot of warlords has been set up, and then it's stabilized, and then usually that's the time a lot of culture will start to develop. Okay, so let me talk about the some cultural background during that. Let's set up as 8th century. Okay, what's going on? And one. So first, the mainstream ideology is branded for Taoism, or we should call it the Neo-Taoism or Taoism religion, and Buddhism. Okay, just like Chris talked about, because during the time is Buddhism is important. And then Buddhism and Taoism had increasingly come to emphasize on the otherworldliness, right? And the Confucianism is more, if you read Confucius analect, Confucius is more focused on this world, not other world. Another new development is so-called imperial examination. Okay, so that's the starting from the Tang Dynasty and get mature in the Song Dynasty and then to the end of the 20th century. So Chinese have 1,300 years experience taking examination. So it's a very important cultural influence. So exam is, but they have, it's a common knowledge of writing, Chinese classic literary style among the state officials. Okay, so the subject had been changed from dynasty to dynasty, and I just have to say during the Tang Dynasty, the test is starting, but probably not that serious compared to Song Dynasty or later on in Ming or Qing Dynasty. So the common culture helped. So this kind of exam helped unify the empire and the idea of achievement by merit instead of legitimacy to imperial rule. Okay, the examination system played an important role to tempering the power of hereditary aristocracy and the military authority. So in this sense, you know, we have a lot of criticism on the imperial examination. But during this period of time, 8th century, I will have to say, you know, I have to say that probably the world's most advanced system during that time. If you look at around the world, nobody have this kind of system. And then everybody, okay, I should not say everybody, most of the people, farmer, okay, if you will, okay, you study, if you are smart enough, you pass the exam, you can become the government officials. Okay, so that's around the world, probably nobody can have this kind of system. So personally, even I have a lot of criticism on the examination culture, but I have to say during that time, that's probably the most advanced. And one thing I like to talk about here is also related to the Empress Wu, is the writing style. If you have been with this meetup for long, and I think for last month or 2 months ago, I started complaining when I translated the ancient Chinese text to English, I faced a lot of difficulty because the writing style has been changed. In the Confucius time or in the Han Dynasty, the writing still, at least for me as a Chinese reader, I can understand easily, and then I work hard, I can translate to English. But later and later, the words become more and more difficult, and then I have a hard time to, even I understand, but it's difficult to translate. So these words sometimes called pianwen, so become very rigid during that time, so-called 4/6 prose. So I just use this one as an example. I don't know, anybody read this one in Chinese before? Quan, did you read this one? 燕卓皇孙之
No.
You haven't read this
No,
one?
my father showed me some of these, but I was too discouraged to keep on.
Yeah, that's okay. So you will say, so the rule basically is 4 words or 6 words. Okay, and 4 and 6. So when you read it, it sounds very well and very beautiful. And this famous writing, and then I read it, and it's a beautiful writing. And this one is so-called the prophet during the Empress Wu. They have the Xu Jingye, that's a general. He raised the army, tried had a crusade against the Empress Wu. Okay, try to restore the Tang Dynasty. Okay. So he usually this kind of crusade, you have to write some proclamation or pamphlet, right, to declare, okay, I'm righteous and you are sinful. So I have the army to fight against you. So this kind of writing, you have to be very convincing, encouraging. So during that time, you have to write in this way. And I have to admit, that's a beautiful writing, okay? And then the writing is, I think I will take hours to translate this one because they call the swallow, the birds kill the son of the emperor, okay, which imply in the Han Dynasty, the beauty Zhao Fei Yan, because her name has Yan, means swallow, the birds, okay, kill the thing. So the second word talk about Long Li Di Hou, they talk about in Xia Dynasty, the beauty was born from the saliva of dragon. Okay, so all this one, you need pack with a historical account to understand, and then they make the words beautiful. So when you familiar this one, when you read it, you find wow, that's amazing word. But you can imagine in another side, how can I do my philosophy? Use this kind of writing, because there's no way to go through this one. So that's the situation during that time. So Hanyu, or today we are going to talk about during this time, and the people are going to, especially Hanyu, is going to make a movement to change this kind of writing. So basics, I will probably introduce 4 people here that I'm talking about. So Hanyu is the most important. Usually people call him one of the 8 great prose master of Tang and the Song dynasty. So they have 8 people. So Hanyu is one of them, Liu Zhongyuan is one of them, and Liao is not. Okay, so because they are writing, make it easy. So personally, I witnessed the change. Who is the, okay? You take care? Okay. Thank you, Joe. So let's put it this way. When I read to Hanyu, Liao, and Liu Zhongyuan, I find out it's easy to read, just okay, much easier than before. So I really benefit from their literary movement. Another way to look at Hanyu's work is kind of like a Renaissance in Europe, right? During the time after Crusade, people start to discover the Aristotle's work, start to look back on the Greek philosophy, because they wake up from the Christian thinking. So same situation. This one is more on the also on the philosophy side, okay, also on the writing side. They start to look at, okay, the old time during the Warring State and early Han Dynasty. They want to go back to the freestyle liberation of writing on this one. So they are similar, they all Confucianism, but they are a little bit different. I just make a quick comment. They are Hanyu, basically, he is promoted the writing, all the writing style, they all agree, but philosophy are a little bit different. They all Confucians, but Hanyu is start to against the Taoism, religious Taoism and Buddhism. But the Liao basics accept Buddhism, okay? So he kind of combined Buddhism and Confucianism together. And Liu Zhongyuan kind of like combined Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism together. And the one thing different between Liu Zhongyuan and Hanyu still have the kind of like a respect for consider heaven and the human interaction. And Liu Zhongyuan kind of total different way. He think human is doing human thing. If we have a disaster, that's our fault, nothing to do with heaven. So they have the slightly different in this way, but in general, we can call all of them Confucianism. So if their movement, they have the thing happen is, I need to have a brief introduction, is so-called the Huichang persecution of Buddhism. So it happened on the year of 841. The persecution of Buddhism is compared to the Western Great Inquisition, the Christian church did is just very, very small, okay? Because it only happened 3 times in China. In general, Chinese treat religious more freely than Europe. So just quickly talk about the reason why have the persecution. Basic is follow what Han Yu is arguing. So first, economic reason, because the war, and they have a war against the Weiwei tribe, and it caused a lot of almost bankrupt the country. So the emperor Wuzong, okay, have confiscated the Buddhist monastery, okay, because a lot of believers will donate gold, to make the gold statue of Buddha. So they have to confess this one. That's for the economic reason. Second reason, for the social reason, because Buddhism focus because the Buddhist monk doesn't have to do the service and they don't pay tax. So the Buddhists undermine the social structure of Taiwan. China. They claim they wrote the loyalty, the son to father and the subject to the ruler, and encouraging people to leave their family and become monk and nun. That's basically Han Yu's argument. And another religious reason, that's Wuzong, the emperor, his personal reason, because he believed he is a strong Taoist religious believer. So he believed Taoism should make people live, pursue immortality, and Buddhism encourage people go to nirvana, which is equal to death, no birth. So when he worried about his own death, he didn't like Buddhism. That's his personal reason. And unfortunately, Wuzong only lived to, I think, 31 years old. He died very young, probably by the elixir, because he practiced Taoism immortality, take a lot of strange chemicals to extend his life. So turned out to kill himself. And after he died, the persecution stopped. So only short period of time. So, but Han Yu's influence to the Buddhism is not make a dent on Buddhism religion, but his influence on writing is long living. Okay, and his influence on philosophy also has a strong influence on that. So basically, I finished the first part of that, and I will stop for a few minutes if you have a comment or you have a question, and that's before we move on to the second part, which is we talk about Han Yu as a person. Yeah. No comment? Okay.
Maybe a small comment.
Yeah, please.
When you were speaking of the prose by Han Yu, of Confucian scholar of the time, that would write proclamation between a war against an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, I would like to make a rapprochement. I would like to make a rapprochement with what is happening today. When the US country, for example, the Western media would make what I would to condition the minds of the people that the country that would be attacked is evil, or the regime has to be brought down. It's look a little bit the same.
Yeah. But the reason I want to, I think it's always the same, but I like to focus is the writing. Even this kind of writing, they have to write this way. It show you how rigid.
But Jason, some texts by the Rand Corporation are masterpieces of geopolitics. You should read them.
Okay, so let's move on to Han Yu. Okay. Okay, so this person, Han Yu. Okay, so let me see what would be my note. So Han Yu was a precursor of Neo-Confucianism, as well as the atheist and the points. Okay, put this way. Even he doesn't know he is doing the Neo-Confucianism. That's the later name. Okay, people call it Daxue. Okay, that we will talk about next week, because during this time he just want to change the writing style. He just want to change the mainstream philosophy. 792, okay, he failed 4 times on the imperial exam, so he not necessarily easy to get his position. And then he tried to not only reform, he also want to reform the Chinese government, and then he rejected the traditional prose writing, so-called the Pianwen, which is introduced, and it becomes so burdened and restrictive rule, and almost impossible in the writing. And the resulting literary freedom gives rise to a new genre of prose of romance. So you will see after him, the writing become more interesting. Okay, we will introduce some of them. You will see it's not possible in using the Pianwen to write, and the Chinese writing become much open. So I will consider this movement, it's a great movement, and the next great movement will be we have to wait until 20th century. Okay, the so-called the language reform by Hu Shi, the vernacular Chinese movement. So people start to write like today we are writing. So you will see this kind of movement is important to open up a culture. But of course, always have some conservative people will think about, well, that cut off the culture from the past. But personally, I will appreciate this kind of movement because you will open up for the new future. Okay. So Han Yu also advocated the centralized government and want to return back to Confucian's idea. And he deployed Taoism and Buddhism as a teaching, which encourages self-centeredness and disregard others. That's his view. And criticized the Buddhism monk and the Taoist priest because they do not work, do not produce, and the worst word, they teach people do not work. So that's his complaint about the social work. So Han Yu believed Buddhism and Taoism were causing the Chinese to think they did not need to worry about their treatment of others in this world. Okay, because they are too much focused on the other world. So Han Yu like to quote from Mencius and Daxue, the Greek learning. I think it's the beginning of this year. I introduced on this one, and I will find the chance to introduce another one, the Doctrine of the Being and the Yijing, which were considered important. So, so his writing has laid the foundation for the later Neo-Confucianists and for the new development. So he attempted his new position in the campaign. So he got the influence. Let me see. So okay. So I think some his famous writing we will introduce study of the way, so-called Yuan Dao, on man, on spirit. Okay. So that's his famous writing. And the basics that I would like to call him as this kind of movement, like a Chinese Renaissance movement. So if I make it simple, you can see his writing, his support the centralized government. He is against individualism. And so this side seems like he's more on the control side, but in the writing, he supports liberation in writing. So it's open up in the philosophical side, philosophical writing. That's he is going to do. So one thing is about his literary reform. Okay, Han Yu boldly advocated to use the Zhou philosophers and early Han writer as a model for the prose and the writing. If you recall, a few slides ago, we talked about the Pianwen. Okay, so this is such a rigid writing, and I would say his movement is strong. And that's also, we can see why he failed 4 times in his imperial exam, because during that time, people probably not appreciate his writing style. Okay, if you think about most of people writing in this kind of rigid form, and people will see his writing is unacceptable. So this reform brought about the liberation in writing. The sentence units in prose writing was now free to seek its own length and the structural pattern, and according to logic and the content, rather than slavish conforming to the rule of 骈文. Okay, with this new literary freedom, Liu Zhongyong, Han Yu's the chief was able to write charming travel and landscape piece, and he wrote a lot of fables. And the new genre of prose writing soon developed, tales of love, romance, heroic feats and adventures, and the many mysterious and supernatural and of imaginary incidents and fictionalized history. These prose romances in classical prose style were written for entertainment and literary and did not reach the mass until much later. Which is so we last time we introduced, so this kind of writing, then the writing start to have his in entertainment purpose. Okay, because most of people start to understand what's the writing. So this situation doesn't happen during the Tang Dynasty, but after the Song Dynasty, the people, more people can read, and the Ming Dynasty, which we introduced, the novel, become the popular. Most of people, well, I should not say most of people, but the people, regular people, as long as you are literate, you can read the novel. Okay, so that's his great achievement. So some of his writing, he write a lot, and I didn't read most of them, but some important I'd like to list here. Okay, important is the one is so-called On the Origin of Dao, Yuan Dao, that's the most famous. And another one is talking about teaching, okay, and then explanation of study. And this one is a proclamation to the crocodile. You can see after you change the writing style, let's open up another way to write. So he writes a proclamation to the crocodile. Basically, he is just accused the crocodile did something wrong, eat people, and he tried to teach the crocodile. And then he just warned the crocodile, I'm going to expel you to the other land. If you didn't listen, I will kill you. So so why he write this? Okay, he is writing to imply, I think that's my taking. Okay, I think he is writing his philosophical idea of the Confucian government. Okay, so it's famous in the Chinese government. Traditional Chinese government is not pure Confucian, right? It's outside Confucian, inside legalism. Okay, so basically that's the style he's treating the crocodile. So the crocodile actually is not real crocodile. It's talking about the corrupt officials. So he kind of used Confucius way. Okay, I will teach you, I will warn you, and then if you are not teaching, not listen, I'm going to expel you or kill you, become very legalist. So that's his way, his idea of government. And even we call it the Confucian government, but actually it's only outside the Confucian, but inside legalism. And this one is interesting, talking about on horse. And he talked about, there's a concept called 伯乐. Okay, that's a famous person who can judge it's a good horse or bad horse. So in this one, he's talking about people complain there's no good horse. No, he said, no. Because you don't find the person who can judge horse. Okay? If you find the right person who can judge horse, then you will have a good horse. So here he is implying the government system, right? So you don't complain, oh, I don't have a good general to fight the war. I don't have a good officials to take care of this. Okay, no, because you don't know people. You don't have a good judgment of people. Only thing you have to bring the right people in. So that's his philosophy. Okay, talking about the political. Okay, and then he talked about the memorial on the bones of Buddha. So every certain years, the emperor, because during that time, the mainstream thinking is Buddhism. So they have a big ceremonial event to open or to show the Buddha. I talked about Gautama Buddha, okay, the bone, I think the pinky bone. He just has a memorial, submit the memorial to the emperor against this kind of event. That's his main argument against the Buddhism. And he talked about a lot of, just like we talked about before, the Buddhism is, we already have the Confucianism, we have many things. We should not go through Buddhism. And they almost put him in trouble, and he got exiled after this. So his achievement, and we will go is later, I think 300 years later, 350 years later, they built a memorial temple of Hanyu, okay, in Guangdong, in today's Guangdong, Chaozhou. Another famous writer, Su Si, he wrote this one very famous commentary about the Hanyu. He talked about his prose reverse the literary decline of 8 dynasty. He talked about the Wei, Jin, and the 4 dynasty, and then Sui and the Tang, okay, the 8 dynasty, the literary decline. And his teaching aided the misguided thought throughout the world. Talk about misguided, okay, thought. Talk about people mainstream thinking go away from the Confucian thinking. His loyalty led him to risk the rest of his master. He got expelled, okay, because his memorial to the bone of the Buddha, and his courage suppressed the general of 3 armies. So the commentary about him is he's a courageous person, even suppress the general of the armies. So that's Su Si's commentary about Hanyu. So that's the brief introduction of Hanyu. And then the next part, before we are going to the core part of today, we're going to talk about the Neo-Confucianism, which has not been very clear during this time, and even not very clear during next week, because next week we talk about cosmology, okay? And the cosmology basically is just the foundation. You have to wait until the later, the Song Dynasty, we shall have to wait another 400 years, and then we will see clear picture of the Neo-Confucianism. We have a hands up on Chris, please.
Yeah, no, Jason, that was really good. That covered it all. I saw the only thing I'll probably just add is that he was really big on logic, right? And productivity. So in that sense, even though he is writing about Confucianism, in the Western parlance, we can actually say he was a political scientist, right? Because his audience is the emperor and the governors. So he's really saying that, hey, you do realize that these Buddhists and Taoists, they make people so lazy and self-centered, and they're completely non-productive. They're both, economically and politically non-productive. They're just a bunch of lazy sacks, right? And it's really useless. So he was very utilitarian that way. And he says, you really should come back to Confucianism, which will serve you much better as a government doctrine and policy. So he was really advising political policy more than just ethical and moral behavior. And his proposals are very logical. He was just saying, hey, forget about whether you believe the afterlife and coming out of the wheel or not. But my philosophy with Confucianism is going to be just much better for you, in the earthly realm, right? So I think that was really good. So he was very, very focused on logic. And then he does make a distinction between Taoism and Buddhism, though, where he really just dismisses Buddhism as a barbaric religion, because it's invented somewhere else, right? And he would just say, well, I mean, like, would you like bow to a bear or a tiger? We're human beings. We're civilized human beings. This religion came from somewhere else. We should not respect. So he was pretty dismissive. Where with Taoism, he's more gentle. He would just say, well, these people are a bit confused between assigning importance to your current life versus your afterlife, right? And your spiritual life. So you really should be more focused on your practical current life. So anyway, but the overall is really good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, I think you mentioned that I carefully read Yuan Dao, the originality of Dao. I like this writing, and not because I agree with him, but I find out interesting. Like, first thing you talk about, he's a political scientist or political philosopher. That's true, because most of Chinese philosophers are political philosopher. And you talk about he is a utilitarian, and that's I also agree, because most of the time people argue is based on the benefit, what's good, right? So we can call him utilitarian. And about logic, that's the part I'm very interested about Han Yu's writing. He's against the Buddhism. He kind of, just like you said, it's a barbarian religion. Why you bow to this foreigner? We have our own sage. Why you do this from the no culture Indian? This kind of thing. But carefully read his writing. He used the logics a lot, which was introduced by Buddhism. So I think that's very interesting. And then I find out the writer. Okay, after this time, they got more clear. Okay, their thinking is more clear. Okay, so their logic become much clearer. They have the reason. They talk about. I think that's all benefit from the Buddhism. Even you reject Buddhism teaching, but you have to use Buddhism logic to reject their teaching, and that's I find out it's quite interesting. Yeah. So okay, so let's move to the third part, and we were talking about the Neo-Confucianism. Okay, so I think this part is important. Because we can say for the last hour, we only set up the background of the historical background, and then we talk about the person. Before I was thinking about we probably bring all the philosophers together, but I think that's probably too messy, and Han Yu probably is good enough to represent this kind of thinking, because we still don't see the result until 400 years later. We will see the Zhuxi have the movement, which will change a lot. So I'm going to read from the writing of Feng Youlan, and I copy from here. I think it's pretty good. Okay, his writing is this. This one is from Feng Youlan, the short history of the Chinese philosophy. He said Confucianism had that by this time, that means the 8th century, already lost the vitality which it had once manifested in the form of such men as Mencius, Xunzi, and Dong Zhongshu, that's in Han Dynasty. The original texts were there, and their commentary and the sub-commentary were even more numerous than before. Yet they failed to meet the spiritual interest, the need of the age. After the revival of Taoism and the introduction of Buddhism, people had become more interested in the metaphysical problem, and in which I call super moral value, or as they were then phrased, the problem of the nature and the destiny. Okay, I think this part is important because in traditional Confucianism, if you are in a group, we read analects, right? Confucius constantly focused on the today's situation, and when he even asked people not just respect the spirit, okay, don't doing too much work on that. So Confucius is focused on this word. But after the Neo-Taoism, and which become similar to the Taoist religion, and the introduce of the Buddhism, people start to figure out something we are missing, right? The metaphysical part is not in Confucius, okay? So, and the formula, I call it the super moral value, okay? I think the proper word in today, we probably want to call it the meta-ethics, right? Or the metaphysical foundation of the morality, okay? So, and then in the Chinese term, they firm it called the, in Chinese word called 性命之学, okay? 性 means the nature, which means the nature of the human nature, okay? So talk about the nature and the destiny. So basically, after the introduction, after the Buddhism and the Taoism religion, right? People not only, so if you start to feel like the Confucian teaching is not enough, so what's my nature, human nature? What's a human destiny? That's the part, okay? Confucians never teach. So we take this part of that. So this kind of problem, you know, even you reject Taoism, you reject Buddhism, but this problem you still need to resolve. Metaphysic problem and meta-ethic problem you need to resolve. So we have seen in before we talk about so they start to talk about this kind of problem are not decade in Confucius' work in Analect, Mencius, and the Doctrine of Mean. Okay, Confucius talk about it, but we never focus much on that. But Mencius talk about human nature, and Doctrine of Mean deal more on the human psychology. This kind of things start to work, and the metaphysics, which will go back to the Book of Change. So this need genuinely new interpretation and elucidation in order to meet the problem of the new age. And this type of interpretation was as yet lacking despite the effort of the emperor's scholar. So that's Feng Youlan's writing about the starting of the Neo-Confucianism, because they have the problem they want to resolve. So this one is talking about also from the Feng Youlan's writing. Basics, he talked about, I think that's also important. There are 3 lines of thought that can be traced as a main source of Neo-Confucianism. The first, of course, is the so-called Confucianism itself. And the second is the Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. I think Feng Youlan used different spelling. So if you prefer the Zen Buddhism, for all the school of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism most influential on the Neo-Confucianism he's talking about. And the third one is the Taoist religion, of which the cosmological view of the Yin-Yang school and become the important part. And the cosmology of the Neo-Confucianists is chiefly connected with this line of thought, which means Taoist religion. So that's the part next week we are going to talk about, but it doesn't happen during this time. It happened in 300 years later in the Song Dynasty. So these 3 lines of thought were heterogeneous and even in many respects contradictory. Okay, so we talk about 3 things, right? Confucianism, Taoist religion, and the Buddhism. They are totally different, and a lot of places they are contradictory. So here come with a very special way of the Chinese synthesizing skill. Okay, basics will have 3 things, try to merge, synthesize together. I think that's a very different. I think at the beginning, someone asked what's the difference between Chinese philosophy and Western philosophy. The contents are different, but the way to deal different concept is also different. That's the way Chinese deal. If you pay attention, it took time for philosophers to make a unity out of them. These three, especially since the unity are not simply eclecticism, right? It's not eclecticism. You just, sometimes I use this one, sometimes I use that, or take the middle. But it's a general system forming a homogeneous whole. So that's why I introduced the journey to the West last 2 weeks ago. Because in the journey of West, you will see the bureaucratic system, okay, and the Chinese worldview, actually it's a combination, a synthesized concept of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoist religion. And it's not just the so-called eclecticism. It's a homogeneous as a whole. So the whole beginning of the Neo-Confucian may be traced back to Han Yu and Liao, okay? And the system also did not become clear formed until 11th century, which we will introduce probably 2 weeks from now. Next week, we talk about metaphysics. This was the time when Song Dynasty and which reunited China after the period of Confucian following by the collapse of Tang and the height of the splendor and the prosperity. Okay, so so here Feng Yulai talk about the Neo-Confucianists were chiefly interested in cosmology. So from here, if we make it simple, is this scholar, they fight against Buddhism and against Taoism religion, but they realize there's something they need to build. And since you reject the foreign teaching, say you got to find something in your own old teaching, which they find out in the Mencius and Doctrine of the Mean. But most important, they are in the Yijing, the Book of Change. So next week, we were going to talk about the cosmologist, which is totally reinterpretation of Yijing, okay, and which will bring to become the foundation of the Neo-Confucianism. So that's the part. And to this point, since we have a new term called Neo-Confucianism, and then we call it Daxue. And if you remember a few months ago, when we talk about the Neo-Taoism, we use a name called Xuanxue, right? And which is happened on the 2nd and the 3rd century. And this term has been formed on the 5th century. So basically, Xuanxue basically focus on 3 books. It's Yijing, Book of Change, and the Dao De Jing, the Lao Tzu, and the Zhuangzi. These 3 books. So this one totally talk about the metaphysics. And then this will lead to more individualism and more on the sort of the free spirit sort thinking. So this one will be thrown away and being replaced with the new thinking about the Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism. So I hope I will make it clear, but I think that going forward we will make it focus on this part. And there's another important part is the so-called transmission of the truth. Okay, it's a little bit complex, but I would like to bring up here. It's also from Feng Youlan's writing. I find out it's interesting. He talks about the theory of the transmission of the truth from Yao Sun, that's the ancient sage, downward through, is already suggested by Mencius, okay, and was evidently re-inspired by Han Yu and Liao, and by the Zen theory and historical teaching of the Buddha has been transmitted through a line of patriarchs to the Hongren and Huiren. Okay, if you familiar with the Zen Buddhism tradition, right? Here talk about the 28th Bodhidharma, okay, come to China, and then he has to transmit his teaching to the second patriarch, Hui Ke, and then who Seng Can, Dao Xin, Hong Ren, Hui Neng, okay, line by line translation. So Han Yu and Liao is trying to set up this line of the Confucian tradition through the history, and according to Feng Youlan, it's re-inspired, okay, by the Zen Buddhism theory. So, I will pause for a few minutes before I go to the history. Yeah, so that's the concept of Neo-Confucianism, and we call it Daxue in another way. Any comment? Okay. So let's move on. For this one, I hope it's not too messy, but I think that's the best I can do. So because if you are not familiar with these people, it will be difficult to read the text from Mencius or from Han Yu's writing, okay, because they have to call a lot of names. So I have to make it a chart like this. So go through the history, okay, 220 BC, okay, that the three sage king, okay, Emperor Yao and Sun and Yu, okay. So when Yao died, he abdicated the throne to Sun, and the Sun abdicated the throne to Yu. Okay, so that's how they, so that's considered sage king. And when Yu became an emperor, he started the dynasty of Xia. Okay, so that's around 220 BC. Okay, very long time ago. And then about 500-600 later, okay, they have the emperor of Tang. Okay, remember it's not Tang dynasty, it's Tang. Okay, of the Shang dynasty. Okay, he has a revolution he set up. Okay, so he also considered as a sage king. And another 500 years passed. Okay, and then there's a famous the emperor Wen of Zhou. Okay, and the Emperor Wu of Zhou, who is his son. Okay, and his brother Duke Zhou. Okay, so these three people, father and the two sons, they have a revolution, set up the Zhou dynasty, and the Duke Zhou, this guy, he became the prime minister, and he set up all the rituals. Confucius has been praised the best of the best. He want everything go back to this period of time. So 500 years, okay, we know we have the Confucius, okay, he's teaching. And 100 years later, they have the Mencius. Okay, so during the similar time, they have the Xunzi, and in the first century, they have the Yangxiong. Okay, so just to remind everyone, just make it quick. Mencius talk about human nature is good. Xunzi is talking about human nature is bad. So we need the education, and later on, his disciple, his student, become the legalism. Okay. And the Yangxiong is the philosopher who kind of tried to revolutionize the Yijing. Okay, so Yijing have yin and the yang, and he make a different kind of Yijing called Taishuan. Okay, so all this, that's the historical background. Okay, so I just want to make sure, you know, we are not too foreign about this name. Joe, please.
Yeah, was Han Fei then the student of Zhonxi?
Yes, Han Fei and Li Si are students of Xunzi. Okay, so I put the X sign here. Okay, because they've been declared as a heresy. Okay, because so the orthodoxy line is going to go through here to Confucius to Mencius. Okay, but no more Xunzi, Yangxiong. No, okay, they are heresy. So in my opinion, this kind of movement, the Neo-Confucianism movement, in a sense, they make Confucianism become a religious-like, philosophy. So even they don't have a god to worship, but their practice is, for example, set up the orthodoxy, and the standard is very religious-like. So by knowing these people, we can read the Mencius, which the Feng Youlan's writing mentioned, but he didn't quote. But it's long. But let me see. So I hope it makes sense from now. Mencius said, that's his Mencius writing. From Yao and Sun down to Tang were 500 years and more. So Yu and Yao, Gao Yao is the minister of law of Yu. They saw these early sages and so knew their doctrine. While Tang heard this doctrine as transmitted and so knew them. And from Tang to Emperor Wen of Zhou were 500 years and more. As Yijing is and Lai Zhu, they are the minister of the Tang of Shang. They saw Tang and they knew the doctrine. And while Emperor Wen of Zhou heard them as transmitted and so knew them. So remember the word, heard them as transmitted, so knew them. From Emperor Wen and Zhou to Confucius were 500 years and more. So as Tai Gong Wang and what's his name? Tai Gong Wang, the San Yisheng, they are the chief ministers of Zhou. They saw the Emperor Wen of Zhou, and so they knew the doctrine. While Confucius heard them as transmitted, so knew them. From Confucius downward until now. So basics, Mencius is talking about every 500 years, they have the sage come out. So when they heard the doctrine and as transmitted, and they knew that. So they all consider, they never think about that's my invention, that's great. So no, Mencius is talking about from Yao Sun, and 500 either, they have the Tang, and the 500 years after, they have the Zhou, Wen, Wu, and Duke Zhou. And 500 years later, they have the Confucius. They all heard the teaching, the doctrine as transmitted. They knew it, so they start to bring up. So that's the sage tradition. That's from Mencius' writing. And this kind of writing has been ignored for a few hundred years. So that's Han Yu's writing. His so-called very famous called Yuan Dao. Sometimes we translate as on the origin of nature of the truth, which is Dao. So you can start to pay some attention on his logic. It's become more westernized logic. So what I call the Dao is not what has here been called the Dao by Taoists and the Buddhists. Because in Chinese, everybody talk about Dao. Yao, the sage king, transmitted the Dao to Sun. That's another sage king. And the Sun transmitted to Yu. And Yu transmitted to King Wen. Even they don't see each other, they don't know each other, they have 500 years apart. They still can transmit it, to King Wen and Wu and the Duke Zhou. And when Wen and Zhou and Wen and Wu and the Duke Zhou transmitted to Confucius. Remember, Confucius is 500 years later, but they still can transmit it. So Confucius transmitted this to Mencius. Mencius is over 100 years after Confucius. He never met Confucius, but Confucius still transmitted to Mencius. After Mencius, it was no longer transmitted. Xunzi and Yang Xiong select from that, but without reaching the essential portion. They discuss it, but without sufficient clarity. So he declared Yang Xiong and Mencius, I believe, and the Xunzi, I believe their teaching probably sort of popular during that time. That's why he declared they are heresy. in another sense. So then he talked about the teaching, the moral teaching of the Confucianism. Okay, he talked about universal love is called benevolence, which is ren, and the behavior which are consistent with benevolence are called righteousness. Okay, so this one is something new in the writing. It starts to make a clear definition, right? Okay, so he talked about moving forward from benevolence and righteousness we call Tao. Something which you have and do not rely on outer environment is called De, which is virtue. Benevolence and righteousness are the noun which have definite meaning, while Tao and the virtue are nouns which do not have a definite meaning. Therefore, Tao has Junzi's Tao and the small people's Tao, and the virtue has good virtue and evil virtue. So here he kind of reversed the importance between benevolence and righteousness versus Tao and virtue. So in Taoism teaching, we'll put, if you read the Tao Te Ching, we usually, Lao Tzu always put the Tao and the virtue as the highest position, and look down on the benevolence and the righteousness. And Han Yu is make a clear definition and said, benevolence and the righteousness is in the high. Okay, they have that's the goal we are doing. And the Tao and the virtue is the way to reach this one. So when you reach this one, they have the Junzi's Tao and the small people's Tao. When you talk about virtue, they have a good virtue, they have a bad virtue. So it kind of reverse the benevolence and the Tao. Okay, so the important become different. So he started to criticize Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu despised benevolence and the righteousness, not because he verified the benevolence and the righteousness, but for he has a narrow-minded. Okay, he started to criticize Lao Tzu, the Taoism sage, narrow-minded. It is like someone who watched the heaven from under the veil. He said the heaven is very small, but actually it's not. Lao Tzu takes small favor as benevolence and the timid and the worried as righteousness. So it is nature that he looked down on benevolence and the righteousness. The Tao which Lao Tzu referred to is his concept of Tao and not the Tao I am talking about. The virtue which Lao Tzu referred to is his concept of virtue and not the virtue I am talking about. All the virtues I have referred to are said in integrating benevolence and righteousness, and they are verdict of the people. The virtues which Lao Tzu has referred to are said without benevolence and the righteousness, and they are only his personal opinion. So basically here, he is used the so-called new logic to criticize Lao Tzu. Okay, he said you just narrow-minded. Okay, you make the wrong definition. So because you are looking at it small, that's why you see the benevolence and the righteousness are small. Actually, because you are following the small Tao and the small virtue. So that's his arguments against this one. So I shall find some time to get more detail on this Yuan Dao because it's really worth to read. And then I just, today's purpose, I just give a flavor, how Han Yu's movement of Neo-Confucianism. And then a few weeks later, next week, we will talk about metaphysics. And after that, you will start to see the influence coming through. Yeah. And then if you compare to the original analects, you will find out, oh, probably very different one when what Confucius original teach. Yeah. So I will stop for a few minutes before I move on for the last part, and I'm going to bring up different philosophy and kind of compare to what Han Yu is talking here. So I hope it's clear. So if you have a question or comment, yeah, please. Okay, so let me quickly make sure we got to the Liao, and there's two more people I'd like to introduce. Okay, so I think I already talked about Liao. Okay, so remember during this time, all the philosopher, you must be in high government position. Okay, which you will see different in the Song Dynasty. Okay, in the Song Dynasty, you can have no job, no real job, and you can be famous. But during this time and before, all the philosophers, okay, people introduced, okay, you got to be in high government position, okay. Otherwise, we don't know because you know. So the basically his difference is he kind of not like Han Yu totally reject Buddhism. He kind of try to integrate many Buddhist ideas into Confucianism and begin the development of metaphysical framework to justify Confucian ethical thinking. And then he start to focus on the question of human nature and the human destiny, which have not been mentioned in Confucius. So this philosopher, including Han Yu and Liao and Liu Zongyuan, they start to quote Daxue, the great learning, Zhongyong, the Doctrine of the Mean, and Yijing, okay, the classic, the Book of Change, to help build on this one. And you will see that very clear the next week. We will totally talk about the metaphysics, which is all based on Yijing. Joe, please.
Actually, no, then you just basically covered what I was about to say with the idea. I just want to ask, how did the development of metaphysics like essentially impact, like what would be an example of the metaphysics impacting Confucian's ethics? Like if you could provide an example of that, but we could go over that next week when we get into the metaphysics.
We will do that, and I think that's a big question, you know.
It is a very big question.
Yes, a very big question. How does metaphysics impact? I think one thing I plan to talk about this to save for next week, but we can mention it, is Thomas Aquinas. Okay, I find out that this kind of thing is very similar to this kind of synthesizing. Okay.
Yeah.
Very similar to Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so when during that time, 13th century in the Europe, most of Christian has been dominated by Platonic. Okay.
Yeah, and it moved to the Aristotle. Yeah, this is exactly where I was going. Yeah.
Discover the syllogism. Okay. How are you going to put this one together? Because the syllogism itself has make sense. Then you want to put together. So same situation as this one in Chinese development. They see the religious, the Taoism religious, and they see the Buddhism. They open different mind, which, you know, it's convincing, or it makes sense by itself, but it's different than Confucius teaching. And they got to develop something, and then they go to the Yijing, okay, to develop the cosmologies. Okay, the book called it the cosmologies. But I think personally more proper name probably metaphysics. But again, you may argue, you should not call it metaphysics because there's no existence of God, there's no immortality of soul, there's no human free will. Okay, but yeah, again, so whatever. Okay, so that's one thing we will talk about this one. And another thing important, that's my personal view. I kind of doubted whether or not Confucius really focus on Book of Change, the Yijing, or not. Okay, I know most of people will say, "Oh, Confucius like this one, do that," but I kind of doubt it because I see probably being added during this period of time. People start to think this one is important, so we put the Yijing in Confucius' mouth on that. Well, again, I'm not going to argue on this one. I know that a lot of people may disagree on this one, and the next week and the following week we can discuss on this one. So,
Jason, may I?
Yeah, please. I know you probably disagree.
No. It's not about the teaching,
Okay.
because but it's about metaphysics.
Okay, please.
Because in the section 2.8.6 of the Mencius, Mencius were talking of the 4 natural seeds of commiseration, of discernment, of rituals, and of respect. Okay, I mean, when a philosopher states as a kind of thesis that in the core human nature, you are born with 4 seeds of, maybe the words that I choose is a bit clumsy, but of spiritual powers, okay? Because after all, respect, discernment, and so on, and commiseration, those are spiritual powers that can be developed into something bigger. Don't you think that it's a kind of pronouncement, of metaphysical pronouncement, of because it's a statement, okay? There is no proof of it, okay? And we know that when we talk about metaphysical considerations, it's about statement about the ontology of reality.
Yeah.
And here we have a very clear distinction between the natural world and the spiritual world. And it's in the text that has been recognized as having been written 23, 24 centuries ago, before some Neo-Confucianism.
Okay, that's another thing. That's my personal philosophy, okay, personal understanding. I don't think the Mencius has been that important before this time. Okay, so if you look at the grand historian by Sima Qian, okay, Mencius may not be that important before this time. Because
before this time, what do you mean? Tang Dynasty or Song Dynasty?
Tang Dynasty, before the movement, okay. Because before that, people hardly mention Mencius. If you look at the Sima Qian's the great historian record, he put the Confucius in the whole set, right? And he put a disciple of Confucius, a lot of it. But how much he write about Mencius? He wrote was probably 1 paragraph, and later 3 people, okay, they put together. So so you can see, probably not that important. And today we constantly call Mencius because of this movement. So of course, Mencius is more mystical, historical, okay, talking about heaven, superpower. Okay, he talked about 浩然之气, the awe-inspiring qi. Okay, that thing is not in Confucius. So again, that's my thinking. Okay, because I try to look at not from the Neo-Confucius point of view. I try to before Neo-Confucius point of view. So that would be a little bit different. So
historically, the 4 books have they been acknowledged during the Tang Dynasty as the corpus of classical?
I think it happened after this time. Okay, it doesn't recognize us these 4 books before this time because you see right now all these philosophers, Liao, Han Yu, okay, they start to talking about the doctrine of mean. They talk about great learning. Okay, and apparently they are not that important before this time. That's why they start to focus. And I kind of suspect Xunzi and Yang Xiong probably popular, not really popular, but people talking about it during that. And unlike today, people don't talk about Xunzi, people don't talk about Yang Xiong. But during that time, probably people talk about this. That's why, Han Yu will say, oh, Xunzi, or Yang Xiong, oh, they only know part of that. So that's the reason I have this kind of statement. Okay. So thank you for the question. I know a lot of people have a different opinion on this one, and I'm not saying I'm right, but basically that's the way I read the ancient text. Okay. So I think right now, we talk about Liao, and let me jump to Liu Zhongyuan, and I think Liu Zhongyuan is a great person, and then Feng Youlan didn't bring much on that. So he is different than Han Yu, even both are Confucianism, okay, Confucians. So basically, we can talk about him. He writes a lot of poems, fable, reflective monologue. He's a good poet, and his service is successful. And then his effort to put the degree of heaven and okay. So his big difference to Han Yu is he rejects the heaven influence to people. He believes any disaster is humans' problem. Okay, so this one make him not so orthodox. Okay, compared to others, because in the later Song scholar, they kind of were in a way to deal with heaven, and that's back to Joe's question. Okay, why they have to do metaphysics of cosmology? When they talk about cosmology, they are not talking about the sun, the moon, the star. They are talking about Yijing, which is try to discover the underlying principle. So in this sense, they want to use the underlying principle to communicate to call heaven or the Tao of heaven. So that's the next week's subject. But basics, that's the kind of movement. And you will know this kind of movement is difficult because we face three different contradictory philosophies. And you don't want to take us eclecticism, all right? Okay, you don't want just average it, or sometimes use this one, sometimes you want to become a homogeneous whole. So that's an effort, and they take 300 years. I think that's a good job for 300 years, and they eventually come with a solution. So I will end today's presentation on this point, and I think this point is represent, because another famous thing is Tang, so-called the poetry of Tang is very famous, and all people read have received Chinese education were being asked to memorize some of them. And this kind of literature movement make this poetry very simple, easy to understand. And I bring this one is written by Liu Zhongyong. And as I remember when I was probably 4 or 5 years, my aunt, who was a Chinese, high school Chinese teacher, she asked me to memorize this, and I think I can understand for the 4 or 5 years old. I don't think I'm smart, but I think because the word is simple. Okay, so basically talk about river snow, and I find that the translation from Wikipedia is pretty good. So just read it. 1,000 mountains, no sign of birds in flight. 10,000 paths, no trace of human tracks. In a long boat, an old man in rain hat and a straw raincoat, fishing along in the cold river snow. So it's very easy, with this kind of simple, only 20 Chinese character. He described this kind of picture in the cold weather, no people, only an old fisherman and fishing in the cold river. Okay, so this kind of thing, so that make Chinese poet is very kind of like painting. Okay, you have this kind of painting, make everything a little bit different. And this one is written by Liu Zhongyong, okay, the great philosopher and literary. And Liu Zhongyong also write a lot of fable, and I really like it. For example, he write a biography of hunchback. All right, he talk about a hunchback is very good in growing trees. He's ugly, but people welcome him. And why? Because he know how to grow trees. And people ask him how to grow trees. He talk about, each tree has its nature. You have to water it. And at the evening, don't put too much attention. Just go home and do whatever you have to do. Okay, don't put. And he talk about a lot of time. People laugh too much, put attention too much. So that kill the tree. So for the tree to grow well, you have to respect its nature. Let's go And he continued to talk about education, right? Just like I think it's very true for today's situation. A lot of helicopter parents, they put too much love, too much attention to their kids. And then he started, and then more, he talked about government, right? He kind of talked about government. He said, oh, some magistrate, okay? They will say, go, okay, you have the water. Go, that's the time to crop, okay? Go, you don't forget to feed your chicken, okay? So this kind of thing, you bother the people because people know what to do. All you need to do is just let them do what they need to do. So he write a simple story and which talk about education and bring to the political philosophy. It's a beautiful writing, simple, everybody can understand, and with a few lines. So I really think Liu Zhongyong is a great writer, philosopher, and in this sense, and he also write a good point. So I will stop here today, and then next week we will talk about different subjects which is related to this one. And then let me put the link on that if I have it. Okay. So next week we talk about cosmology, which will jump ahead 300 years in the Northern Song, and then we will talk about the cosmology. And some people will feel more interested in this one because a lot of people ask about Yijing. So next week, no moral teaching. Everything is about Yijing, yin yang, and this kind of thing. And then just like Joe asked, how does it related? Okay, well, I hope I will get the answer from here. So let's give a few minutes to discuss if you have a question, comment, suggestion, complaint, yeah. No? So I hope, today's presentation makes sense. It's not too dry, and I kind of feel like it's difficult. Only a few pages, and then I try to stuff in so many things together, and then make my job a little bit difficult. And then I wish I talk about the journey to the West, which is more fun to talk about.
Yeah.
I want to say thank you. I learned so much my first time, but I really learned a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome. And then, by the way, if you go to the sign up sign, and they have they have the link, you can see the recording and the PowerPoint presentation will be there. But it's not. It takes me about 1 or 2 days to post, but it will be there. So if you want to have a further reading or something, and they're welcome to send me the information and question if you want. And Javier, please.
I also want to thank you. It was very instructive and constructive. And I hope I get the pleasure to join next week. Thank you.
Yeah, hope you join. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And
thank you very much, Jason. This was wonderful. I really appreciated it.
Yeah, okay. So let's say I will expect a little bit more discussion, but since going to this period of time, it's a little bit difficult because probably it's most of the people are not familiar with this kind of subject. So yeah, that's a little bit difficult. Yeah. Anyway, at least I do it, and I just have to say thank you, everyone. And we only lost, let me see, 5 people from the beginning. So so that means and then because I know sometimes you have 50 at the beginning and then only have 10 at the end. So anyway, so it's not too bad. So great, and thank you everyone. And I just have to say, personally, I enjoy prepare this kind of material, kind of organize my mind. And then when I talk this one, I start to realize something I'm not very sure. So, and sometimes people challenge me like, Kwan, okay, sorry, but I really appreciate it because I don't want just sitting in myself, just like Han Yu talking about sitting in the whale watching the sky. Okay, so I like to open up and have the people give me different opinions. Yeah, Thank you.
Jason,
I like learning from you, Jason. Thank you.
You are welcome, and then hope enjoy your weekend. And then
Jason,
see you next
personal
week.
question. Are you a historian?
No, I'm nothing.
But you
I'm an
wrote a
engineer,
book.
and then right now I have more time. And personally, I like philosophy, Western Chinese philosophy, and then I think it's one thing I benefit a lot because I lead a reading group to read the Bertrand Russell's Western philosophy, with a history of Western philosophy. I think that helped me a lot, not because learning the philosophy, because learning how to read between history and the philosophy. So I start to read the Chinese philosophy in this way. And another thing, Chinese philosophy start to make a lot of sense to me. Yeah. Okay, thank you. And please join us next week. See you. Bye.
Ciao.